As we continue our journey through Acts, again and again we'll find ourselves marvelling at the prolific output of the infant church empowered by the Holy Spirit. It's absolutely right to focus on what the Spirit's doing in the early church, but today I want to spend some time reflecting on the input of the early Jesus followers. Before we do, if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to pause the video now and spend some time reflectively reading Acts chapter 2, 37 through 47. Luke has just shared Peter's first sermon. We've seen 3,000 people become followers of the way of Jesus, 3,000 people turning their lives around. Can you imagine the joy and the chaos? As the Spirit of God continued to move amongst them, adding to their number daily, what did those first Jesus followers do? Luke tells us that they devoted themselves to 4 things. Let's unpack them one by one. Firstly, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. The apostles would have taught from the familiar books of the Old Testament. As well, they shared their experience of all the things they'd seen Jesus say and do. Secondly, we read that they devoted themselves to fellowship. Luke introduces a term here that's used 20 times throughout the New Testament. The Greek koinonia, translated as fellowship. Each time this word's used throughout the New Testament, it refers to sharing, either sharing something or sharing some experience. Luke tells us that the early Jesus followers were devoted to this fellowship, to sharing their stuff and sharing their lives with one another. I wonder, this devotion to fellowship, to sharing their common life, what difference did it make in the fledgling church? As the Spirit reigned amongst the believers, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, and, Luke tells us, to the breaking of bread. This term's used in 2 ways throughout the New Testament. Firstly, they broke bread and shared it as Jesus had commanded them to in remembrance of him. And secondly, breaking bread describes them meeting together in their homes, sharing in meals together. So here they are, devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread together, and Luke tells us they were devoted to prayer. Can you imagine those first Jesus followers praying their ancient prayers now endowed with new meaning? Can you imagine them praying new prayers which carried so much ancient significance? I find it hard to imagine what a church totally devoted to prayer looks like, but I can't imagine that it didn't have a significant impact on what the Spirit was doing amongst them. So here they are, those early Jesus believers, devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. What happened? What difference did it make? Luke tells us that everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. What was it like to be part of a community where the Spirit reigned and where the Lord added to their number daily? Here are some questions to ponder. Sit with them, discuss them amongst yourselves, share them in your small groups. How do you understand devotion? And how might we measure devotion? And by whatever measure you might use, what things are you devoted to? As you reflect on your life, how devoted are you to the apostles' teaching? And what does that look like for you? What about devotion to fellowship, koinonia, sharing our lives with one another? How devoted are you to sharing your stuff? Is there stuff you don't like to share? And what about being devoted to breaking bread together? How often do we find ourselves at one another's tables? How often are we remembering what Jesus has done for us? And what about prayer? It's one thing to pray, but what does it mean to be a people devoted to prayer? What might that actually look like? I wonder, to what extent do you think our devotion impacts the Spirit's output amongst us as we seek to follow in the way of Jesus together?